Welcome to International Management, the podcast that breaks down the core challenges and strategies of global business. Based on Orlando Casabon's scripts for his international management class, each episode offers practical insights, clear strategies, real-world examples, and expert guidance to help you navigate complex global landscapes. For additional resources, visit casabon.com. Now, let's dive into the essentials of international management.
All right, everybody, welcome back for another deep dive.
Yeah.
You know, we love to get into the nitty-gritty of global issues, and today we're going to tackle something that might seem a little dry at first, but I promise it's full of intrigue and even a little bit of drama.
It really is.
We're talking about national trade policy.
Yes.
And economic development.
It's a big one.
It is a big one.
Yeah.
You know, we all kind of experience this in our daily lives, but we don't really think about it.
Right.
Like, why are some products more expensive than others?
Exactly.
Why are certain industries booming while others are struggling? Well, it all comes down to how governments try to manage and manipulate trade. You know, and they do that to try to achieve certain economic and sometimes even political
for sure.
goals. So today we're going to unpack two big strategies that governments use when it comes to trade, export promotion, and import substitution.
Right.
And we'll look at real-world examples of how these strategies have played out, you know, with some countries becoming huge successes like Singapore and South Korea and Taiwan after World War II, and others facing some challenges along the way.
Yeah, it's fascinating how all these different countries kind of approach it in different ways, and there's pros and cons to each approach, as we'll see.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right, so to kick things off, let's talk about why governments even get involved in international trade in the first place.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, wouldn't it be simpler if they just let the free market do its thing?
Right. Well, you would think so, but it's not always that simple.
Yeah.
Governments have all these different objectives, and sometimes those objectives lead them to want to kind of step in and try to shape how trade flows across their borders. You know, one major factor is national security.
Right.
They want to make sure that their country has access to essential resources and industries in times of crisis, especially.
Makes sense.
Like, you know, we always talk about the national defense argument.
Oh, yeah.
You don't want to be relying on another country for something like steel to build warships if you're in the middle of a conflict.
Right, like you don't want to be caught with your pants down
Exactly.
in a situation like that.
Yeah, so that's one reason. But it's not just about wartime scenarios. Governments also want to protect jobs.
Right.
And foster new industries that they think are important for the long-term health of their economies.
Yeah, they're thinking about the future.
Exactly.
Okay, so how do they actually do that?
Yeah.
What some of the tools in their toolbox when it comes to influencing trade?
Well, one of the most common tools is tariffs. You know, those taxes on imported goods. They're a way to make foreign products more expensive, which gives domestic producers a competitive advantage.
Right.
And tariffs come in a few different flavors. You've got what are called ad valorem tariffs, which are calculated as the percentage of the value of the goods.
Okay.
Then you got specific tariffs, which are a fixed amount per unit, like per ton or per barrel. And then combined tariffs, which are a mix of both.
Oh, okay.
Ad valorem and specific.
So like a little bit of both.
Exactly.
Interesting. So if a government really wants to discourage imports of a particular product, they could just slap a really big combined tariff on it and make it super expensive for people to buy.
Right. They can make it so expensive that consumers just won't buy it.
Right.
Or they'll be more likely to buy the domestic product.
Yeah.
But tariffs aren't the only game in town.
Right.
Governments also have a whole arsenal of what we call non-tariff barriers, or NTBs, at their disposal.
What are those?
These can be a bit sneakier and harder to quantify, but they can be just as effective at influencing trade.
Okay.
So let's say a country wants to protect its domestic textile industry from foreign competition, right? They could impose quotas which limit the quantity of textiles that can be imported each year.
Okay.
Or they could require importers to obtain licenses, creating a bureaucratic hurdle that can be costly and time-consuming.
So it's not just about making things more expensive. It's about making it more difficult to actually get the products into the country.
Exactly. Sometimes they make it so much of a hassle that importers just give up.
Wow.
And then you've got product standards.
Okay.
These can be used to exclude foreign goods that don't meet certain specifications. Sometimes these standards are legitimate.
Right.
They're there to protect public health or safety. But sometimes they're just a sneaky way to give domestic producers an advantage.
Oh, interesting.
You know, it's like setting the bar really high for a high jump competition, knowing that your foreign competitors can't quite clear it.
I like that analogy.
Right.
Okay, so what else is in the NTB toolbox?
Well, we can't forget about subsidies.
Okay, subsidies.
Those are government payments or tax breaks that can give domestic companies a leg up in the global marketplace. Subsidies can help companies lower their production costs, making them more competitive on price.
Right.
But they can also distort trade and lead to accusations of unfair competition.
It's a delicate balance, isn't it?
It really is. Governments have all these tools they can use to influence trade. But those tools can be used for good or bad depending on the motives and the specific circumstances.
Right, and that's what makes this whole topic so interesting.
Absolutely. And it gets even more interesting when we start talking about what's known as strategic trade policy.
Okay.
This is where governments use trade as a lever to achieve broader economic or even geopolitical goals.
Strategic trade policy, that sounds kind of like a chess game.
It is a bit like a chess game. Governments are making calculated moves to try to gain an advantage in certain industries where global dominance is really a winner-takes-all game.
Oh, wow. High stakes.
Yeah, exactly. High stakes. Imagine two countries.
Okay.
Let's call them Alpha and Beta.
Okay, Alpha and Beta.
And they're both trying to become leaders in artificial intelligence.
Okay, so like a futuristic tech race.
Exactly. They're both pouring tons of resources into research and development, trying to get ahead. Now, let's say Alpha's government decides to offer generous subsidies and tax breaks to their AI companies.
Okay.
While Beta's government takes a more hands-off approach.
Right.
Those government incentives could give Alpha's companies a big advantage,
Makes sense.
allowing them to invest more in research, attract top talent, and ultimately bring new AI products to market faster.
So they get a head start
Exactly.
and potentially dominate the market.
Right, and that dominance can translate into economic and geopolitical power.
Wow. So by strategically using trade policy, Alpha could leapfrog ahead of Beta in the AI race.
Precisely.
And reap all the rewards that come with being a leader in that technology.
Right, but strategic trade policy can be risky.
Oh, how so?
It can lead to unintended consequences, trade wars, even harm to other industries.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's a bit like playing with fire.
Yeah, definitely high risk, high reward.
Exactly, and we've only just scratched the surface here.
I know, this is already so complex.
It is, and there's a whole other layer of complexity when we start talking about how countries use trade to promote economic development, particularly in developing countries.
Right. That's where those two big strategies we mentioned earlier come in: export promotion and import substitution.
These are two very different approaches to using trade as an engine for economic growth.
Okay, so let's break those down. Help me understand the difference between export promotion and import substitution.
Okay, so think of it this way. Export promotion is like saying, let's leverage our strengths and become a major player in the global market.
Oh.
It's about encouraging domestic firms to compete internationally, focusing on industries where they have a comparative advantage.
So it's like specializing in what you're good at and selling it to the world.
Exactly.
Okay, and what about import substitution?
Import substitution is more about building up domestic industries by protecting them from foreign competition. It's about encouraging local production for local consumption,
Okay.
trying to become more self-sufficient.
Gotcha. So export promotion is outward-looking, embracing global markets, while import substitution is more inward-looking, focused on building up domestic capacity.
Exactly. And each approach has its own set of pros and cons, its own track record of successes and failures.
All right, now I'm really intrigued. Let's unpack these two approaches in more detail and see how they've played out in the real world.
Okay.
What are some examples of countries that have successfully used export promotion to boost their economies?
Well, some of the most striking examples come from East Asia after World War II.
Okay.
Think about the Asian tigers, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Hong Kong.
Yeah.
These countries were relatively poor at the time,
Right.
but they embraced an export-oriented growth model focusing on industries like electronics, textiles, and shipbuilding.
And look at them now. They're economic powerhouses.
Exactly. They transformed themselves in just a few decades.
Yeah, it's incredible. What were the key ingredients of their success?
Well, they invested heavily in education and infrastructure,
Okay.
creating a skilled workforce and a business-friendly environment.
Smart.
They also kept their currencies relatively weak, making their exports more competitive on price.
Oh.
And they pursued very aggressive trade policies, opening up new markets and forging strategic partnerships.
So it wasn't just about cheap labor. It was a combination of smart government policies, a focus on innovation, and a willingness to compete on the global stage.
Exactly. And their success really inspired other countries to follow suit, including China, which has become a global manufacturing powerhouse in recent decades.
Right, so export promotion can be a really powerful engine for economic growth.
Absolutely.
Especially for countries that are willing to play to their strengths and embrace the challenges of global competition.
Right. It's not a guaranteed path to success, but it has worked for many countries.
Okay, so what about the risks? What can go wrong with an export-oriented growth strategy?
Well, one risk is that it can make countries overly dependent on global demand.
Oh, okay, I see.
If there's a slowdown in the global economy, those export-dependent economies can be hit hard.
Yeah, that makes sense, like putting all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. And over-reliance on exports can also lead to what economists call a race to the bottom in terms of wages and working conditions.
Oh, how so?
Well, as countries compete to offer the lowest production costs, they might start cutting corners on labor standards and environmental regulations.
Right, so it's not just about economic growth, it's about making sure that growth is sustainable and benefits all segments of society.
Exactly.
Right. Okay, so let's flip the coin and talk about import substitution.
Okay.
What are some examples of countries that have tried this approach?
Import substitution was a popular development strategy in the mid-20th century, particularly in Latin America, Africa, and parts of Asia.
Yeah.
Countries like Argentina, Brazil, India, and Nigeria all experimented with this approach, trying to build up their domestic industries by protecting them from foreign competition.
What was the thinking behind this strategy? Why did so many countries embrace it?
Well, there are a number of factors. Many of these countries had recently gained independence from colonial powers.
Right.
And they were eager to assert their economic sovereignty.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
They wanted to break free from their dependence on raw material exports and develop more diversified, industrialized economies.
So it was partly about national pride and a desire for greater economic independence.
Exactly. And there was also this belief that import substitution could help create jobs, reduce poverty, and promote industrial development.
Right. Sounds good in theory, but how did it actually play out in practice? Did it live up to the hype?
The results were mixed, to say the least. While import substitution did lead to some initial industrial growth in some countries, it often came at a cost.
What kind of cost?
Well, by protecting domestic industries from competition, import substitution often led to higher prices for consumers, lower quality goods, and a lack of innovation.
Well, that's kind of like a double-edged sword. It might have helped some domestic industries, but it also hurt consumers. And stifled innovation.
Exactly. And in the long run, those protected industries often struggled to compete internationally.
Why is that?
Because they hadn't had to face the same level of competition as their counterparts in export-oriented economies.
Right. They were kind of coddled, and then they got thrown into the deep end.
Yeah, you could say that.
And as global trade liberalization gained momentum in the 1980s and 1990s, many of those countries that had pursued import substitution found themselves falling behind their more outward-looking counterparts.
Right, they just weren't as competitive.
So it seems like import substitution ultimately proved to be a less sustainable path to economic development than export promotion.
I think that's a fair assessment, but it's important to remember that every country is different.
Right.
And there's no one-size-fits-all approach to economic development.
What works for one country might not work for another.
Exactly. It all depends on the specific circumstances, the government's goals, and a whole host of other factors.
Right. And that's what makes this whole topic of national trade policy and economic development so fascinating.
It really is. It's a complex and constantly evolving landscape, full of competing interests, difficult choices, and unintended consequences.
It's like a giant puzzle with no easy solutions.
Precisely. But by understanding the different pieces of the puzzle, the motivations of governments, the tools they use, the different approaches they take, we can start to make sense of this complex world and navigate its challenges more effectively.
Well said. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground today, but we've only just scratched the surface.
Right.
There's so much more to explore when it comes to national trade policy and economic development.
Absolutely.
But for now, we're going to take a little break.
Okay.
And when we come back, we'll dive even deeper into this fascinating topic, so stay tuned.
All right, sounds good.
We'll be right back.
It's funny how those non-tariff barriers we were talking about before, they can be a bit like chameleons changing their appearance depending on the situation.
Oh, yeah. You mean like something that looks like a normal safety regulation?
Uh-huh.
Might actually be a sneaky way to protect domestic industries?
Exactly. Like take product labeling requirements, for example.
Are they?
On the surface, requiring clear and accurate labels on imported food.
Right.
Seems perfectly reasonable.
Right. Yeah, of course, protects consumers.
Exactly. But if those labeling rules are super complex or specific, they can become a big barrier for foreign producers.
Right.
Effectively giving an advantage to domestic companies.
It's like a hidden protectionist agenda.
Right. It's not always easy to tell the difference between legitimate regulations and disguised protectionism.
Yeah, that's tricky.
It's a challenge for organizations like the World Trade Organization.
Oh, the WTO.
Yeah, they're trying to be the referee in this global trade game, making sure everyone plays fair.
Right. Keep things level.
Exactly. It's a tough job, and they don't always get it right.
Yeah, I bet.
But the goal is to prevent countries from using sneaky tactics to give their industries an unfair advantage.
It's like a constant cat and mouse game.
It is.
With countries finding creative ways to bend the rules without breaking them.
Exactly. And sometimes those rule-bending tactics cross the line into unfair trade practices.
Like what?
Like dumping.
Oh, yeah, dumping. We hear that term a lot.
We do.
But what does it actually mean?
Basically, dumping is when a company sells its products in a foreign market at a price that's lower than it costs them to produce.
Okay.
Or even lower than the price they charge in their own home market.
So they're selling at a loss.
Yeah, at least in the short term.
Why would they do that?
Well, there are a few reasons. Sometimes it's a way to get rid of excess inventory.
Okay.
Other times it's a more strategic move to gain market share. Even if it means taking a hit financially at first.
Right.
The idea is to drive out your competitors.
Okay.
And once you have a dominant position, you can raise prices.
So it's kind of predatory.
Right. It can be very predatory.
Is that legal?
A lot of countries have anti-dumping laws to protect domestic industries from this kind of unfair competition. But proving dumping can be tricky. You have to show that the company is selling below cost and that it's actually hurting domestic producers.
So you can't just say, hey, they're selling stuff too cheap.
Right. You have to prove that they're intentionally trying to harm domestic competitors.
Yeah.
And that can be hard to do legally.
Yeah, I think it gets political too.
Oh, it definitely does. When one country accuses another of dumping it, it can lead to a trade war.
Right, tit for tat.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about the darker side of trade protectionism, sneaky tactics, unfair practices, but it's not all bad.
No, not at all. Governments also use trade to promote economic development, especially in developing countries.
Yeah, like with export promotion and import substitution.
Right. Those are two very different approaches to using trade as a tool for growth.
So let's dig a little deeper into those, starting with export promotion.
Okay.
What are the key principles and how has it worked in practice?
So export promotion is all about encouraging domestic firms to compete in international markets. It's about finding industries where a country has a comparative advantage.
Right. Play to your strengths.
Exactly. Maybe they have access to cheap labor, abundant natural resources, or special technological expertise.
Right.
And then you focus on developing those industries and selling those products to the world.
Find your niche in the global marketplace.
Right. And it often involves a combination of government policies and private sector initiatives.
Okay.
Governments might provide subsidies or tax breaks to help their companies compete internationally.
Okay.
They might invest in infrastructure like ports and airports to facilitate trade.
Right.
And they might negotiate trade agreements to open up new markets for their exporters.
So the government plays a supporting role, but it's really the private sector that drives the growth.
Exactly.
And has this strategy worked?
It's been a really successful strategy for a lot of countries, particularly in East Asia.
Like the Asian tigers we talked about.
Oh, yeah. Right. And there are plenty of other examples. China, Vietnam, Thailand. Countries that have gone from low-income agricultural societies to middle-income or even high-income industrialized economies.
Wow.
In just a few decades, largely thanks to export-led growth.
It's an amazing story of transformation.
It really is.
But we talked about the risks, too, like becoming too dependent on global demand.
Right, that's a big one.
And what about that race to the bottom we mentioned?
Yeah, that's another concern with export promotion. You don't want to sacrifice labor standards and environmental protections in the pursuit of economic growth.
Right. It needs to be sustainable and benefit everyone.
Exactly.
Okay. So let's turn to import substitution, which we touched on earlier.
All right.
It was popular in the mid-20th century, but not so much anymore. Why is that?
The main problem with import substitution is that it tends to create inefficient industries.
Oh, how so?
They're shielded from competition, and they lack the incentive to innovate. When you protect domestic producers from foreign competition, they can get complacent. And they often produce goods that are more expensive and lower quality than what you could get on the international market.
It's like you're protecting them too much and they never learn to compete.
Exactly.
So in the long run, import substitution can actually hurt economic growth.
It can, because it makes a country less competitive internationally.
Right. If your industries aren't producing goods that can compete globally, you're going to have a tough time growing your economy.
Exactly.
It's kind of a trap. You think you're helping your industries, but you might actually be hurting them in the long run.
Right.
That's why most economists today favor a more open and market-oriented approach to economic development. One that focuses on trade liberalization, investing in people, and sound economic policies.
Exact.
But I imagine it's not easy to just flip a switch and go from a protected economy to a free trade economy.
No, it's definitely not easy. You have to do it carefully and strategically.
All right.
Provide support to industries that might struggle with competition, and invest in retraining programs to help workers transition to new jobs.
So it's all about finding the right balance.
It is.
Between the benefits of free trade and protecting people's livelihoods.
Exactly. It's a complex challenge, but it's one that we have to face head on.
Speaking of challenges,
Yeah.
let's talk about a specific example of how trade policy can have unintended consequences.
Okay.
The Passenger Vessel Services Act of 1886
Oh, yeah, that's a classic example.
and its impact on the cruise industry.
Right. It shows how a law that was intended to do good can sometimes backfire.
So for those who don't know, the Passenger Vessel Services Act basically requires ships traveling between U.S. ports to be built in the U.S. And mostly staffed by U.S. citizens.
Right.
It was designed to protect the American shipping industry, but it ended up having this weird impact on the cruise industry.
Right. Because of this law, a lot of cruise lines that sail to Alaska choose to start their trips in Vancouver, Canada, instead of Seattle.
Oh, wow. So instead of boosting the U.S. economy, it's actually sending business to Canada.
Exactly. The cruise lines figured out that by adding a stop in Vancouver, they could get around the law.
Right, because then it's considered an international voyage.
Exactly. So a law that was meant to protect American jobs actually ended up costing American jobs.
Well, that's unintended consequences for you.
Yeah, it shows how policymakers really need to think carefully about the potential ripple effects of their decisions.
Right, especially in a global economy where everything is so interconnected.
Exactly. One small change can have a big impact somewhere else.
It also shows how powerful special interest groups can be.
Yes.
In shaping policies, sometimes to the detriment of the broader public.
Right. In this case, the shipbuilders' lobby was strong enough to push through a law that ended up harming other parts of the economy, like tourism.
It's a reminder that trade policy is often driven by politics as much as by economics.
Absolutely.
And those political considerations can sometimes lead to outcomes that aren't in the best interest of everyone.
It's something to keep in mind as we analyze trade policies and try to understand their true impact.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
From the reasons why governments intervene in trade, to the different tools they use, the problems of dumping and unfair trade practices, and the different ways to promote economic development.
Right. It's been a whirlwind tour of international trade.
It has, but hopefully we've given our listeners a good foundation for understanding this complex topic.
I hope so, too. It's a crucial topic in today's world.
Absolutely. And to leave you with something to think about, dear listeners, here's a final question. In a world where borders are becoming less and less important, and global supply chains are becoming more and more complex, what will the future of trade look like?
That's a big question.
It is. How can we make sure that trade policies adapt to the challenges and opportunities of the 21st century?
Those are the questions we need to be asking ourselves.
We do, because the answers will shape our economies and our world for years to come.
I agree.
Yeah, it's amazing how even small decisions can have these huge ripple effects that we don't always see coming.
Exactly. It's like a chain reaction. You know, one thing leads to another, and sometimes it's hard to predict the ultimate outcome.
Right. And those unintended consequences can stick around for a long time.
Oh, absolutely. A perfect example of this is Argentina's attempts to boost its domestic electronics manufacturing.
Oh, yeah. Argentina. What happened there?
So their goal was to create jobs and build a homegrown tech industry, which is a great goal.
That's good so far.
But the way they went about it, focusing production in this remote province called Tierra del Fuego.
Tierra del Fuego. I remember you mentioning it before. It's like way down south, right?
It is. It's practically at the tip of South America.
Wow. Okay, so what happened?
Well, they decided to implement this import substitution strategy.
Right.
Slapping high tariffs on imported electronics and offering big tax breaks to companies that set up shop in Tierra del Fuego.
Okay, so they're trying to make it really attractive to produce electronics domestically.
Exactly. Reduce their reliance on foreign goods.
Right, but Tierra del Fuego is in the middle of nowhere.
It is incredibly remote.
So how did that affect things?
Well, think about it. Most of the parts they needed for electronics assembly had to be shipped from Asia all the way to Buenos Aires,
Right.
and then transported another 1,900 miles south to Tierra del Fuego.
Oh, wow.
And then once the electronics were actually assembled, they had to ship them back to Buenos Aires to sell them.
So you're talking about a ton of extra transportation costs.
A ton of extra cost and logistical headaches.
Yeah, not very efficient.
Not at all. And of course, those costs get passed on to the consumer.
Right.
So electronics assembled in Tierra del Fuego ended up being way more expensive than imported ones, even with the tariffs.
So the policy created some jobs in Tierra del Fuego,
It did.
but it also hurt Argentine consumers.
Exactly. They had to pay a premium for their electronics.
It's a classic example of how import substitution can backfire.
It is. It can lead to higher prices, fewer choices, and less innovation.
Because those companies don't have to compete as hard.
Exactly. They're protected.
It's a reminder that even when governments have good intentions, their policies can sometimes have these unexpected negative consequences.
Absolutely. And it highlights the need to really think through all the angles, economic, geographic, political,
Right.
before you implement a major trade policy.
Well, I think we've done a pretty good job today of really exploring this complex world of trade policy and economic development.
I think so, too. We've covered a lot of ground.
We have the motivations behind government intervention, the tools they use, the challenges they face, the different approaches to promoting development.
Right. It's a constantly evolving landscape.
It is, and it affects all of us in so many ways.
Absolutely.
So to wrap things up, I'd like to leave our listeners with one final thought.
Okay.
As technology keeps advancing and global supply chains become even more interconnected, what does the future hold for international trade? How can we ensure that trade policies are fair for all another, sustainable and beneficial for everyone involved?
Those are the questions we need to be asking ourselves as we move forward.
We do, because the answers will shape our world in profound ways.
I agree. It's an exciting and challenging time to be thinking about these issues.
It is. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the world of national trade policy and economic development.
It's been a pleasure.
It has. And to our listeners out there, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into a pressing global issue.